This is an interview with Mr. Hugh L. Gordon for August 30th, 1922. The date is February 19th, 2004, and the interviewer is Robert Gardner. Mr. Gordon, can you tell me what war and branch of service that you served in, and what your rank was?
I was in World War II. I signed up as an aviation cadet shortly after Pearl Harbor. I think I was 18 or 19 at the time. And from the very outset, I knew I wanted to be a pilot in the Army Air Corps. I lived in Norfolk, Virginia, which is a big Navy town. And I was familiar with the Navy. In fact, I was working at the Naval Operating Base as a clerk when the war began, and that's when I signed up. But that was my passion, is to get into the war and be a pilot and to be in combat. And I had my ups and downs as we get into this thing, and I'll tell you my emotions as I went through it.
Do you recall your first days in service?
Yes, I signed up in early '42, and they called me to duty in November the 11th. I guess Armistice Day, ironically, and they sent us to Richmond, Virginia, and at that point in time we were in the service. And then we were sent to Nashville, Tennessee, which was a classification camp, and where we were given physicals and tested and so forth to see what we were capable of doing.
Can you tell me about your boot camp or training experiences?
Wow. It was very interesting because at that time, the United States was just not ready for war. And I'll give you an illustration of that. In 1939, when I was junior year in high school, that summer I signed up for a citizens military training camp in Fort Meade, Maryland. 30 months. Well, actually, I was 16 at the time, pretty young. First time away from home. Learned to be a soldier. Wore the leggings and I think they call them puttees, and a campaign hat, big brim campaign hat, and we learned to we're on the rifle range and machine gun and pistol range, and learned to take weapons apart and that sort of thing. But the interesting thing about it, to illustrate the unpreparedness of our country for war, is that when it came to marching, they didn't have enough rifles to go around, so we carried wooden rifles. And you'll remember the various movies of the times where they had exercises. They would have a truck with a big sign on the sign that says tank. So then I went back again when I graduated from high school. I went again to the Citizens Military Training Camp, and that would be in summer of 1940. So when the war came in December, I was sort of oriented to the military and didn't want to go in the Navy. Lived in a Navy town, as I mentioned, and nothing wrong with the Navy, but the glamour of the Air Force was appealed to me. And I truly wanted to be a pilot. I truly wanted to get to combat. So we started after a month or so in Nashville, which was a camp that was put up out somewhere and outside of the town, and in a hurry. And this is typical of every place we went as aviation cadet. They had thrown up these buildings and cleaned off. The streets weren't paved, and it was mud, and everywhere you went, and showed that we were not ready. But we were learning to be a soldier, and served KP duty, and marched and went to class and that sort of thing. Then we got on the troop train. We got our orders to go to a pre-flight. They wouldn't tell us where it was. So there were several hundred of us on the troop train, and we went south from Nashville, and we thought, well, we're going to Biloxi, Mississippi or something. And then we were going west, and I thought, well, we're going to San Antonio. Nope. And we ended up in Santa Ana, California, which is just outside of LA. And I'll never forget when we got off the train, we had duffel bags. That's all we had was the duffel bag. And as we approached the camp, the cadets on guard duty were wearing what looked like gas masks to keep the dust out, because they were having a Santa Ana windstorm at that time, and the wind was blowing the dust and stuff, sand horizontally. And that was our introduction to Santa Ana. So we were there for, I don't know, 6 to 8 weeks, and again, determining what we were qualified to be. And I qualified to be a pilot. So from there, we went by train to Phoenix, Arizona, and Thunderbird Field, which was an interesting place. Well, we hit right up soon. We were in Santa Ana. I've got these letters here that some letters that I had picked out that I'd saved. I think letters that I had written to my mother and father, and must have been 70 or 80 of them. And in one of those letters, I told about our anxiety of where we're going to go. You know, are we going to go to Cal Aero, which was a primary training, and I mentioned in the letter several of them. Or were we going to go to Thunderbird Field in Phoenix? And I mentioned in the letter that a magazine called Hornet called Thunderbird Field Hollywood's version of what pilot training should be. I thought that was interesting. I certainly wouldn't have remembered that if I had seen my own handwriting on it. But it was a big field outside of Phoenix. We had to take a mile square area, all dirt, and that was the airfield, with a wind T in the middle of it. And then we stayed in what looked to be like a huge motel. One-story motel with grass in the middle, and while we were there, they put in swimming pools, which we never went in the swimming pools because they had an epidemic of measles, and it would just we were very restricted on some of the things we could do in cohabitating. And there we were introduced to our instructor, and the instructors at Thunderbird were primary training. They were civilians, and Lindstrom was my instructor. And I'll never forget my first flight in an airplane. And a P-17 Stearman airplane was a biplane that I think they were all painted yellow for some reason. And it had a 250 Continental radial engine that I can show you a little bit. Is now okay time to do this? Let's take a look at this.
Okay. Beautiful picture of you
Okay.
in front of the
All right,
plane.
what that is, you see the engine there.
Mhm.
And that is what we wore. We had a leather helmet with metal Gosports coming out to our ears, and attached to those Gosports were the tubes, the rubber tubes for communication. And then we had another tube with a little funnel, and we talked to each other like that, you know. And at Thunderbird and the Stearman, I sat in the back cockpit. It's an open cockpit. Of course, the goggles we put on because we were right out in the fresh air, the wind. And the instructor was before me, and that was interesting because on the ground our airplane was slanted like this, and then I had to taxi and I could hardly see over. And so when you taxied, your airplane went one way and then this way, so you could see what was ahead of you. You sort of zigzagged across the field because you didn't have clear vision in front of you. Now, when I got to basic training, it was the other way around. The student pilot trainee was in the front seat and the instructor was in the back seat, and that plane was all enclosed. I'll get to that in a few minutes. We had about 8 hours, at which time you were expected to be able to solo. And we went up, and I remember the letters I wrote home. I said, you know, you would think that it would be very easy to fly straight and level without dipping the nose down or up and without varying from side to side. But that's the first things you were taught, is to do that. And then as time went on, we learned to do acrobatics, and I'll tell you that in a minute. But as I say, we were expected to solo in about 8 hours, and but they never told you when it would be. So this huge 1 mile square field, dirt with the wind teasing in the middle, and you had planes flying down multiple all over that thing, if you can imagine. Everything was crowded. Everything was a big rush to get us trained, and everything was in a hurry and with a lot of numbers, whatever we were doing. And so one day, after we had landed, we were over sort of the edge of the field, and the instructor, Lindstrom, unstrapped himself and got out of the airplane and said, I think I'm gonna, and I read this in one of my letters. I'm speaking from memory, not from actual memory, but what the letters that I wrote home to my parents. Said, I think I'm gonna stay over here for a little while, and why don't you just take it up for a little bit. I said, don't forget to come back and pick me up here, because he was a long way from the hangars. And so my first flight was uneventful, and then we went into more acrobatics, so doing slow rolls and snap rolls and loops, and then Emmelmans, where you fly like you're going to make a loop, and then you level up and you're going in opposite directions. And there were other things that we did. Spins, always the first thing you do when you learn to fly is you learn to get out of a spin. And this PT-17 was a wonderful training plan, because it's easy to fly, so to speak, but difficult to land. That was the one problem with this plane. The landing gear was rather narrow, and when you came in, if you let your wing dip and touch the ground, you would do a spin right there, because that would grab the plane and spin you right around. That happened quite often. I wrote home and I said, I can fly. I can fly. And it was a tremendous excitement for me. And of course, we went into town and on the weekends, and I had a little girlfriend there, and when I went overseas, that she sent me, wrote me letters and that sort of thing. Then we got to the point where we had been approved, and we were graduating, and we were going to be sent to a basic training. So that's another period of anxiety, and we said, where are we going? I mean, and we knew of the basic training sites, and so we got together and just talked about that and speculated with great anticipation, and it was a lot of fun. A lot of fun. Well, I was sent to Pecos, Texas, to an Army Air Force base there, Army Air Corps base, and my instructor was this is a military base, and the instructors were military officers. Captain Walker was my instructor, and BT 6, I think it was, or 17. It was called the Vultee Vibrator. It was a closed canopy, bigger plane, much bigger plane, more sophisticated cockpit. I wrote in one of the letters, I said, just the instruments in the cockpit alone cost $10,000. This is the impressionistic kid away from home, learning something every day. You know, I was not very worldly, even though I'd been away from home once, twice, in those 2 summers at CMTC. I was learning something all the time and creating an impression. But we were so excited, and in the situation I was in, I was frequently roomed or bunked with other cadets in the alphabet G. Goldstein, for example, twice I was 2 different individuals. I roomed with Goldstein, and I'll never forget. He was ahead of me a little bit and flying. He'd come in a little earlier, and he made his first night flight, and so I came in one night, and he was sitting on the edge of the bunk with his hand in his head, and he was great emotional trouble. I knew that. And what had happened is that he had set his altimeter wrong. The elevation, I think, was something like 500 feet. The 500 feet was the altitude in which, over the ground, over which you make your landing pattern. You come in at a 45, you downwind, you turn to your approach. Well, what happened, this is a night flight, first time he'd been up, and this sounds impossible that this could happen. But when he made that turn on his, towards the strip, his wing bounced off of the desert. And, of course, frightened him immensely. And he, fortunately, got out of it, and he hit the throttle and pulled up and got to the proper elevation, came back and landed. But because of that, he was washed out. And that was what was hurting him when I came in. That was the kind of experience he had. And so he went with a large number of cadets that were washed out and just waiting around for orders from Santa Ana as to where they were to go. And there were several choices. Most of them went to gunnery school, which meant they did not get their commission. And then others were fortunate enough to be trained as either a bombardier or a navigator, in which case they would get the commission. And as I say in my letters, I mentioned this was and I did wash out shortly after this, but this is stuff that happened before. And then after a flight, after about 7 hours or so, they told me that my instructor told me that I was being washed out, and he didn't like the way that I was handling the turns. He felt I was holding, if I was turning right, I was holding the right rudder too long, and that was dangerous because it could put you in a spin. You know, you get the throttle, you get the stick, and then your rudders, and so probably it was the best thing. I had no way of knowing, you know, whether I would make a good pilot. I did real well in primary. In fact, I came back and I wrote in my letter that the instructor came in and said we had a good flight. You did good today, and that made me feel real good. Now, I'm backtracking to my primary flight training, steerman. They were tough. All these instructors were tough, and if I was not, this is early beginning when I was learning to fly straight to level. This is one of the first flights, and he let me know who he was in control, and he was not happy with the fact that I was not holding this thing on the line that he wanted me to. So the next thing I know, here I am holding the stick here. And the stick, he had taken the stick and he was slapping me on the leg. And of course the plane was going like this every time he did that. And he said, I'm trying to do this, you know, starting hard like this. not exaggerating. I was so excited, I didn't even understand what he was saying, and he was shouting at me and everything. But fortunately, I knew he was in control, and I'd listened to him, and I tried real hard to do what he wanted to do. And fortunately, I made it through primary. But when we got to basic training, it was more cut and dry. And they were eliminating the cadets by the dozens, really. And it probably had something to do with what they needed in the war. In other words, they would, and it also was clearly the right thing to do if they felt you might kill yourself or run a plane or something and kill somebody else. So that was a tremendous blow. Like I told you earlier, that this was my dream, to be a pilot. And going back to the CMTC camps that when I was real young in the military, I knew I wanted to be in the military for the war, get ready for it. And all this anticipation, all this fun and everything. And this came to be as I look back at my letters that I sent home, that this was a defining moment for me, in a way, in life experiences. I learned to deal with this kind of adversity. My bubble had been burst, and I was truly devastated. But in my letters to my parents, I was trying to tell them that I could deal with it, and don't worry about me. You knew that I'd lost my goal, and I was very concerned as about how they would deal with it. But I was a single child, you know, and they knew I was probably devastated, not revealing my true feelings. So I had several days just to deal with that and to see whether or not we would be referred to gunnery training or what. And finally, they came in and said, we've got this new thing, it's radar. We can't tell you much about it, but you could get your commission. It turned out to be night fighters. And at this time, they really didn't know much about it. It was just beginning to change. And so I was then sent to Tyndall Field for gunnery training, which was a part of my training as a radar observer night fighter. And they didn't know what to call us, but there were two people in a night fighter, and the pilot, and of course in the front, and we were separated in these planes. In the back, we really couldn't see the pilot. We had to communicate by intercom. But I had a whole bank of radar screens there, and we learned to do night interception, in which the RO, as we were called, would pick up the bogies and direct the pilot on the interception. It dealt with airspeed, left, port, right, starboard right, up, down, so forth and so on. And when we got into combat practices in the States, we would be directed to incoming bogies by ground control interception. It's called GCI. And we got to know those people. They were part of really the night fighters. They were separate location, but when we were on leave, we would see those guys, and we got to know them real well. So we were trained for that, and then we graduated from I went down to Boca Raton. I'm trying to get myself together here for radar training, and I remember our classes were enclosed in the wire fence with barbed wire on top. We could not take our notes outside of that area. And this was all super confidential at that time. And so I went through that, and I got my commission as a flight officer. They I don't think they had that classification very often, but I was an officer, and they gave me $150 to go to I went to Saks Fifth Avenue in Miami, bought this hat and my pinks and my khakis, and all of my officer uniform for $150. And then we were sent back to California, to Fresno, California, Hammer Field, where we would be team up with a pilot and be in combat training. And I teamed up with a man, Jim McQueen, that I had known in Nashville, and he'd gone on to pilot, and we just coincided. So that was, and we had operational training there. We flew up and down the Joaquin Valley, and my wife likes to tell the story about the people. Said, have you tell you the story about when they flew under the Golden Gate Bridge? And of course we did, and that was against the rules. But I don't think we invented that. Then we went overseas and we were assigned to 418th Night Fighter Squadron. We're sort of running out of time here, aren't we? We got 30 minutes, okay. Okay, Jim and I were, we developed our own method of interception that was written up for the benefit of other teams, night fighters coming along in the States. So we flew across, landed in Hawaii, and saw the some of the buildings with machine gun holes in the steps and everything, remnants of Pearl Harbor. And ended up in Port Moresby, British New Guinea, which is the closest place in New Guinea to Australia. And eventually we were assigned, it was the rainy season. And to get from our tent to the latrine or the mess hall, we had to walk on a plank. And if you stepped off the plank, you were probably going to have mud inside of your shoes, or you might even leave your shoe in the mud. We had to dig a trench around our tent with a little wall so that the water would not flow right through the tent, but flow around the tent. So one of the things I noticed in my letters home, that there's certain things that appeared in every letter. Always the little weather reports, you know. And sometimes it was very relevant. We weren't complaining anything, but sometimes we said we didn't fly today and it was raining and we couldn't do what we intended to do or something like that. And the other thing that was mentioned most often was food. My wife says, what, are you starving or something? And I wrote one of the letters and I said to my parents, I am not starving. I said, it's just that we have the same food all the time and it's not appetizing. And you know, Spam of course is notorious, but there were other things that we had. We were all canned and everything. And then in my letter, I wrote down a menu of what I'd like to have them send me if they could. And I said, if this is taking some of your food points, don't use up the food points to buy stuff to send me. That's not important. But this is what I wanted. So there were other things like that, and there were times in which in combat there were days in which you were down really, and I think you'd say, I'd write in the letters that this is a dull day, not much happening here. We play poker, and that sort of thing. I had 51 combat missions. The night fighters, we're not like the day fighters where we flew in formation and there were frequent flights. It's not unusual for day fighters to have 100, 150 missions and shoot a lot of planes down. Our CEO, Major Carroll Smith, was the ace night fighter of the Pacific during the war, and he had 7 kills or victories. I hate the word kills, but that's what we used at the time. We had 2, and I'll tell you about those in just a minute. We moved up with MacArthur as he moved up from Hollandia to a little island called Biak off the northern coast of New Guinea. That was Dutch New Guinea, Owie, O-W-I. is the place where we stayed. But that's where we joined the 418th. And when I got there, one of the people was being sent back for, I don't know, he's mentally distressed and just not able to go through combat anymore. And that happened. That was my first experience with that. Then we went from there to an island named in the Dutch East Indies called Morotai. Morotai was a base that as soon as the strip was cleared, we went in and we set up our squadron just off the far end of the runway. It was in a banana grove, actually. And we had a parachute inside of the tent, which was made of, I think it was made of silk. And you had a flap up top and an opening. And we had a monkey or two that would come in, believe it or not, and get in that and slide down that parachute. And if he could talk, I think he would be saying, "Wee!" And he was having fun. But that monkey gave me a problem because we had a T over our bunk and a mosquito net. We were all enclosed, and he was jumping up and down on the mosquito net, and sort of bothering him. But we were subject to raids virtually every night because the Japanese, the Japs, we should call them, or Nipponese, or Nips in those days, they would come behind the Halmahera Islands, which is a string of islands that protected them from the radar. And then they'd go through this relatively short span of water, being right on top of us and dropping bombs before we could even know it. And I remember one night, I was down at the flight line and with our flight surgeon, who had duty down there. We were in a Jeep, an open, no-top Jeep, just perched along the runway, and he was on duty to, if anything, accidents or anything, he would help. And I was down there like a busman's holiday, let's go down the flight line and see what's going on. They had P-40s coming in, and one of them got off the runway and got stuck in the mud and flipped upside down, and with gas all around, and we jumped and got in the car, the Jeep, and we went over there, and the pilot was trapped in there, and somebody in the group said, "Don't light a cigarette," and the pilot almost went mad. I mean, it was really just an unfortunate comment that put terror in his mind, and he got out all right. But that was just typical of the unusual things that we did. Then we next moved to the Philippines. As is well known, MacArthur returned to the Philippines on the island of Leyte. And most of the islands were bypassed. And the Japanese, several 100,000, I think, threw out all those islands, and MacArthur just bypassed all of them, cut off their supplies, and they were virtually helpless except he didn't want to get caught. We went down in the jungle. We were told to ask for Colonel Johnson, ask the Filipino guerrillas friendly guerrillas if we ran into those, and he would take us. He would know that he needed to take us to some place so we could get out. In the move from Morotai to Mindoro, we went up to the island of Mindoro. The tip of the island was a little place called San Jose. I didn't see any city there, but it's on the map as San Jose, tip of the island, this pretty good sized island. And that's where we had a strip and secured. And then we flew out of there to protect against the planes coming down to attack either all our bases or some of the naval ships that were coming up there. It's another part of the story. Can we pause just a minute? Can we pause just a minute? When our squadron, the 418th Night Fighter Squadron, got ready to move up to the next place, which was the island of Mindoro. As soon as they secured the strip on there, which is a place called, as I mentioned, San Jose, then our air crew would come up and bring the planes up. Preceding that, though, our ground crew, with all of our tents and supplies and everything that's needed to set up a camp, were on a boat. And with some of the flight crews who, we had extra flight crews, and so they were on this particular boat. And at this time, General MacArthur was aboard a convoy of, I never knew how many ships. I think it was about 70 ships. Naval history would know. But it included aircraft carriers and a lot of destroyers and other warships and troop ships. And they were headed up, making their way from the southern Philippines through the Sulu Sea out into the South China Sea, parallel to Manila and way out from Manila, and then to go up to Lagayan Gulf, which was above Manila, and land there and come down and capture Manila and free General Wainwright, Corregidor, and all of that. So we were providing night cover for this convoy every night on this trek up through the Sulu Sea out into the South China Sea. We were following them. Then the ship that was taking our ground crew up was attacked. And on the morning of the landing, LST 738, carrying the 418th Ground Echelon, fell victim to another member of one of the Japanese auger squadrons. That's the kamikaze. The kamikaze hit the ship dead center, and it exploded, and everybody jumped overboard and swam ashore, or the best they could. Some of them were picked up by boats. But the sea was covered with oil, there was fire, and we were very, very fortunate. We didn't lose a single person, flight with a single person aboard. I could have been aboard that ship, but I was back in Morotai, and I had hepatitis, infectious hepatitis, yellow jaundice, and they did not release me to fly. So I would have been on that ship. Then some of the guys that were wounded, there's a long list of them, and at the top of the list is Second Lieutenant Mortimer Goldstein. I'll tell you an interesting story about, Mort. Mort was a good friend of mine, and he, like me, was an RO, and we were in training together. And after the war, Mort decided to be a regular Army, and Army Air Force at that time. So he stayed over and was in the finance branch of the Army Air Force. And at some point he knew that, or felt like, that he would probably not get full consideration for promotion with the name of Goldstein. And so he changed his name, and as he contributes that to his ability to be, when he retired from the military, he was a brigadier general. He'd gone all the way up to brigadier general. Yeah, Mort and I are good friends, and we meet, and we've met a number of these night fighter, World War II night fighter reunions, and he's a good friend of mine. And when he writes me a letter, it's Mortimer Gordon, brigadier general, retired. He changed his name to Gordon. Isn't that something? I said, I hope I helped you to become a general. And he said, well, that was my strategy, and it worked. That's unfortunate that discrimination existed like that, but so that's just one of the things that we experienced there. I had to talk my way out of, I was being treated by doctors from the Mayo Clinic, and they put me on sour balls, and pure sugar diet, glucose, and absolutely no fat, and that sort of thing. And I lost a lot of weight. I was skinny. I was skinny to begin with, but and I was all yellow. But I wanted to go in combat, and I joined my group, and they said, fine, we're going to release you. I'm going to get ready to be released. And in my letters home, I said, I think they're overprotective because they want to make sure they release you to combat that you're not going to have a recurrence of your problem. So I joined our squadron right after the first of the year. I was in the hospital Christmas, and let's say in the hospital, it was a tent, and the sides were rolled up and tied. And right outside the tent was a foxhole. And when the sirens went off, I don't care how sick you were, you'd roll out and try to get into that foxhole. But anyway, I joined the squadron, and oh, this was the luckiest thing in my career, and the highlight of my career. As the fleet got up about parallel to Manila, and one day before they were to land in Lingayen Gulf, we were providing night cover every night, and there would be one plane covering that convoy all throughout the night, from dusk to dawn. And so we got up there about 3 o'clock a.m. and let me see if I can find that combat report. You know, I'll hold that just a minute. I'm looking now at my combat narrative that I wrote and had typed somewhere in the squadron. Somebody can type, and this was dated January the 8th of 1945. We were required to turn in a combat report. I won't read all of it, but it goes like this. Takeoff was at 3:03:45. We arrived at the patrol area east of the convoy at so-and-so, and we vectored southeast, and we were directed by ground control, GCI, interception, to a bogey. And so I got the bogey on screen and directed the pilot, Jim Queen, and the bogey was down just about on the water. I mean, really, really close. And we had big flaps in the wings to slow the plane down. That was unique to night fighters because we had to be behind the enemy and not in front of them. so we don't become the chasee instead of the chaser. And then we dropped the flaps down and we dropped the wheels down because we were fast overcoming this plane. And it turned out to be a Jake, and I identified it here as a float plane with an open cockpit. It was an observation plane. And this plane was obviously scouting this convoy for bombers that were to come in shortly. Part of the story. And we got a visual on this plane, and then we slid out in front of the plane, and they started. The guy in the cockpit with a gun on a swivel started firing at us. Jim, that SOB is shooting at us. He said, "We're gone," and he hit the throttle when we got out of there. We made a little elevation. And then about 5:30 a.m. we took a vector so-and-so and to a bogey heading towards the convoy from the east. And fighter control kept giving us these vectors, and it's all in here. We're technical. Made a hard turn port, and I kind of picked up the bogey at 8,000 feet and 20 degrees above us. And we looked like there that it was apparent that there were two elements of two planes each flying formation. They later, when we got a visual on them, we knew that they were what a plane called a Betty, a Japanese plane called a Betty. And the Betty is equivalent to a B-26, which is excellent medium bomber for us. And we closed in, and Jim called fighter control to find if there were any friendly formations in the area. We didn't have a clear identification of the planes. And at 2,000 feet, the pilot obtained a visual as fighter control told us to break off, we were entering the ACAC range. You can imagine, there was a moment of terror there. 70 ships or more would cut loose on them, they'd get us. And the chances of us getting through that, obviously I'm not being overly dramatic here, but I have enough experience now to say that that was a very touchy moment. And we fired 2 long bursts and a diving port train and observed the plane crash in the water below us. Then Jim made a deflection shot and got the second plane. And then the other 2 by that time were turning around and heading home, which is Clark Field near Manila. And Jim, I said, well, let's go get them. Jim, we got 2. And he said, we're out of ammunition. And oh, that was a huge, I don't know, problem. Because we got back and an armament officer looked in there and he said, you got plenty of ammunition. But there were some switches that weren't turned on or something. And I talked to my pilot friends at these reunions and asked them, how could this happen, you know? But it did happen. And had we had the ammunition, I think we could have gotten at least 3 and possibly a 4. I don't think they could have gotten away from us. And that would have been a lot more than the distinguished flying cross we got for shooting down the 2. So that was the highlight of my career in the Army Air Corps right there. And we came back and we were very, you know, pleased. That's what we were over there for, is to protect our forces. Now, you know, I thought about this quite a bit, that how much protection did we provide? I think it's quite apparent that if those planes had not been stopped, and none of them dropped the bomb, that the damage could have been quite severe. It wouldn't have taken but 1 bomb on 1 ship. Is that, you want to do something with that? It wouldn't have taken but 1 of their bombs hitting 1 of our ships, aircraft carrier or whatever, a supply troop ship, to kill a lot of people. And that was a period of time where the kamikazes, I've already mentioned, we lost their ship coming into Mindoro with the kamikaze, and the kamikazes were there, and the mentality was, if you're not going to come home, put your plane into a ship. So I think looking back on it, that apparently was more important than we realized at the time. At the time we didn't really think about that, but I've had a lot of time to think about it. Now there were some other actions that we had when the convoy was coming up, and we covered it every night at dusk. At dusk, the fighter planes from the carriers would come in and land. They wanted to do that before they had to turn the lights on and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of activity when we reached the convoy area. There were planes all over the place, and that's the one time in which we had more than 1 P-61 night fighter flying in the air at the same time. And we were flying in and out of clouds, and it was it's something like you'd see in the movies, really. But I don't know if anybody's ever been up and you fly through a cloud, and all of a sudden, bingo, there's a whole world right below you. It's a wonderful sensation. It's scary to some people because you feel like you're falling off of a cliff, but you get over that, you know, real quickly. But it was, looking back on it, was rather sensational. So we came through this cloud, and there, right in front of us, was a zero. Goodness gracious, right in front of us. But before Jim could hit the trigger, the plane exploded into a ball of fire, just like you see in the movies. And we went right through that ball of fire. You've seen it many times in the movies. And we experienced it. Fortunately, there was no damage to us. Well, what had happened? Another one of our night fighters over here was already trailing this guy, and he got him just seconds before we fired. And when we got back, it was our friend Al Sorbo and George Kirsta, his RO. And they got 2 planes that night, and that was one of them. So that was one of the highlights of our experience there in the Philippines.
Do you recall the day your service ended?
Well, the war ended in August, and it was, I've got it so here somewhere, about October. It was about October '45.
What did you do in the days and weeks afterwards?
When the war was over?
Yes, sir.
Oh, just everything is to wait, hurry up and wait. You know, just waiting to see what was going to happen. And finally we caught a plane. Some of us, I was given the opportunity to be a part of the occupational army, and I would be promoted from first lieutenant to captain and be in charge of the radar operator group. But I turned that down. Other friends went and served in Japan. But I came home on a troop ship all the way. And remember, as we pulled into San Francisco, we went to the rear of the ship and threw all our dirty clothes away that we would not be needing anymore.
Did you work or go back to school?
Yeah, I went back to college and eventually went to Virginia Tech, got a degree in industrial engineering, and came to Georgia Tech, got a master's degree, and went to work for Lockheed. And I worked for Lockheed for 38 years in Marietta, Lockheed Aircraft Company. And where we were building planes. And I was the head of personnel and human resources and retired as that in 1988.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
Good question. Yeah, it made me appreciate the importance of the military defending our nation. And I think about the current times and what's going on over there in Iraq. I can identify with that. Times have changed so much. In World War II, the military was treated with great respect wherever you went. I had a girlfriend at every stop, and they sent me letters overseas, and I have their letters. And there was a great deal of support for the military. These are people that, girlfriends that, you know, didn't intend to marry. They just wanted to help the troops by writing letters. I have my Dear John letter. This blue letter right here is my Dear John letter from my little girlfriend in West Palm Beach. And she was sweet. And she married a Marine. And yes, I think it gave me insight into war. You know, my experiences were different than foot soldiers, no question about that. We did lose about 28 people in our squadron, which is a pretty good percentage of the number of people in our squadron. So we did face death, and we faced danger. And one of the most hazardous times, if I can deal with that for a minute, was coming back from our mission from Okinawa to Kyushu, which was about a 6-hour mission. We would go up there, and it's a intruder mission, unusual for the night fighters, although it became a very important part of our function. And we would carry a 1,000-pound bomb and on one wing and a big gas tank on the other, and fly up and circle around the airports, or designated airport. One of them was near Nagasaki. Kyushu is on the island of Nagasaki is on the island of Kyushu, and I don't know what I'm pronouncing that right or not, but we would fly around, and if they turned on the lights to have some logistical movement at night, then bingo, we dropped the bomb on them. And our story was we weren't going to fly back with that bomb, so you know what we did with it. We dropped it anyway. And then we would go down on the deck and see if we could find some shipping. And I remember one night we did find some ship, and I picked it up on the radar, and we ran an interception on a ship. It wasn't a big ship, but it was a pretty good sized ship. And Jim cut loose and probably sank it. He hit it, and we didn't stay to see if it was sunk, and we would have gotten credit for shooting down the ship if we had. But we had 4 20mm cannons underneath and 4 50s up in a fixed turret on the top. And believe me, we had the firepower to sink a ship. Well, when those 20s went off, the smoke came back to my part of the ship. That was but coming back from one of those missions, I was getting to this hazardous point. We were always flying over water. And I can show you this. These are silk maps that we had that show the wind currents and the water currents. So if we went down and we were sitting on top of a raft that we would inflate, and we would use these waterproof maps to know where we might go with the current and the winds. And we also had other maps that we carried that they look like a mess, but they're silk, and of course they're waterproof. But we were coming back from Kayusha one night, and Jim says there's somebody following us, and so we did evasive action, and this plane that was behind us was really following us very close and just getting ready to shoot us down. But it was certainly in range of that. And so this lasted quite a while. It was evasive action, and we got way off course, which is what I'm going to tell you. And it turned out Jim broke radio silence and asked who it was. And it was one of our own guys. I think it was the new captain that we had, Bill Sellers, and his RO, and they thought we were a Jap plane coming down to Okinawa, and they were going to make sure that we were friendly. But by the time that was all over, we had sort of lost our direction, and we kept going for about another hour, and I couldn't find on the radar screen, even on long range, exactly where we were. And so we had to make a decision. We're out over the Pacific, and we don't know whether to go south, east, or west. And we had a limited amount of fuel. It's a long mission. We dropped that wing tank a long time before that. So we didn't have time to circle around and investigate where we were. So that was one of those delicate moments that we had overseas, and that could have been disastrous. Can you stop just a second? This is a shot, obviously, of our plane, not our plane in particular, but the P-61, and you'll see it's a biplane with the center section, the pilot up front, and the RO is in the back in the enclosed area, and some of the armament is apparent there. You can see it all right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. My experience in combat is that we had a very narrow picture of the war. I've learned more about our part of the war as we come back and look at films on the war on television. And when something comes on, I yell to my wife. I said, "Hey, this is where I was. This is right where I was." And we get a perspective of the war that after it was over that I cherish. And then we had these in order to accentuate our memories. We had biannual
reunions of World War II night fighters, in which we found out how close we were and how we were all comrades in arms, and we developed this appreciation. I think my blood now is made of red, white, and blue. I can, that feeling, of course, you revisit that with current controversy we have in Iraq and around the world. But it was an extraordinary experience that I'll never forget. And trying to pass this on, this tape, of course, will be available for my children and grandchildren who are very interested in the war, and it's part of their education to know what it's like to, in a time of emergency, to serve your country.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been my pleasure to do this interview with you. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this for us.